Some losses never stop aching, even after 30 years of trying to forget. For mountain trapper Amos McBride, the memory of his wife's sudden disappearance still cuts deeper than any Colorado winter wind. When Amos arrives in the forgotten mining town of Silver Point seeking shelter, the locals give him one warning about the old livery barn. A strange dog guards a pile of snow there, day and night, never letting anyone close. The townspeople whisper, "That dog guards the snow pile. Best leave it be," but this dog is different. It watches Amos with knowing eyes, as if recognizing something familiar. When the creature finally leads him to that guarded spot and Amos digs beneath the frozen ground, he discovers a buried strongbox filled with letters, photographs, and his wife's journal. What secret was she protecting in this remote place, and why did she never come home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through Silver Point like a blade through old bones, carrying with it the promise of a hard winter. Amos McBride pulled his weathered coat tighter as he guided his pack mule down the main street, if you could call the frozen dirt path between ramshackle buildings a street. The town looked like God had taken a handful of structures and scattered them across the mountainside without much thought for order or beauty. 43 buildings. He counted automatically, a habit from his army days that never quite left him. Most stood empty now, their windows dark as dead eyes. The great silver boom had ended 20 years ago, taking most of the population with it. What remained were the stubborn ones, the broken ones, and those with nowhere else to go. Amos figured he might qualify for all three categories. His wedding ring caught on the mule's lead rope as he adjusted his grip. The thin gold band had worn smooth over 30 years, a constant reminder of promises made and broken. He'd never taken it off, not even after Sarah vanished without a word, leaving nothing behind but questions that gnawed at him like hungry wolves. The ring felt heavier in winter somehow, as if the cold made the metal remember its weight. The general store squatted at the street's center like a fortress against the elements. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady grey column, the only sign of life in the frozen tableau. Amos tied his mule to the hitching post and stomped the snow from his boots before pushing through the door. A bell chimed overhead, mournful as a church bell. "Help you with something?" The woman behind the counter looked to be pushing 60, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun, and eyes that missed nothing. Her name, he'd learn later, was Martha Kellerton, and she'd run this store since her husband died in the mine collapse of '89. "Need supplies for winter," Amos said, pulling off his gloves. "Heard there might be a cabin available for rent." Martha's eyes narrowed as she studied him. Strangers weren't common in Silver Point, especially not the kind that looked like they could handle themselves in a fight. Amos stood 6 feet even, with broad shoulders and hands that showed the calluses of honest work. His beard, more grey than brown now, couldn't hide the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, a reminder of his last mission for Uncle Sam. "Depends on what kind of winter guest you're planning to be," she said finally. "We don't much care for trouble here." "No trouble," Amos assured her. "Just a man looking for a quiet place to wait out the cold months." Something in his voice, perhaps the weariness that came from carrying grief too long, seemed to satisfy her. "There's the old Henley cabin about a mile east of town. Been empty since Tom passed last spring. Nothing fancy, but it's got a good roof and a stone fireplace." "What's the rent?" $50 for the season, plus you keep an eye on the place. Tom's nephew back in Denver don't much care what happens to it, but I promised I'd see it looked after." Amos nodded and began gathering supplies from the shelves. Coffee, flour, salt pork, beans, the staples that would see him through until spring. As he moved through the store, Martha watched him with the intensity of someone reading a book, written in a foreign language. "You got the look of a military man," she observed as he set a bag of cornmeal on the counter. "Was, long time ago. My husband served in the war between the states. Never lost the bearing either. Some things mark a man permanent like." Amos paid for his supplies without comment. The past was a country he preferred not to revisit, especially the parts that involved uniforms and following orders that kept him awake at night. He'd learned that most folks respected a man's right to his silences, at least out here, where everyone carried their own ghosts. "One more thing," Martha said, as he loaded his purchases into a wooden crate. "There's an old dog hangs around the livery barn. Been there near 3 years now. Folks leave him be, and he leaves them be. But he's particular about that snow pile next to the barn. Don't much care for visitors getting too close. What's under the pile?" Martha's expression shuttered like windows before a storm. "Nothing that concerns a winter guest, I'd expect. Just thought you should know, case you go wandering around town at night." The conversation felt unfinished, heavy with words left unspoken, but Martha had already turned her attention to rearranging the items on her shelves. Amos loaded his supplies onto the mule and asked for directions to the cabin. The ride east took him through a grove of aspens that rattled their bare branches like skeleton fingers. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed up against a granite outcropping that would block the worst of the northern wind. It was smaller than he'd expected, but solidly built, with thick log walls chinked tight against the weather. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and mouse droppings. The previous occupant had left behind a few pieces of furniture, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame that looked sturdy enough. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing clean. Amos built a fire and sat in one of the chairs, listening to the wind test the cabin's defenses. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to think about Sarah without immediately pushing the memories away. She'd loved winter, had always said the snow made everything clean and new. They'd planned to build a cabin like this one, somewhere far from the noise and hurry of civilization. That was before little Thomas came, before the fever took him, before grief carved a canyon between them that neither could cross. Sarah had left on a Tuesday morning in March. No note, no explanation, just her wedding dress hanging in the closet and her Bible missing from the nightstand. He'd searched for her, spent every penny he had hiring detectives and following false leads. But Sarah had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. The logical part of his mind knew she was probably dead. A woman alone in 1895 faced dangers that could kill her 100 different ways, but his heart had never quite accepted it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he'd imagine her voice calling his name. Sometimes he'd wake reaching for her side of the bed, finding only cold sheets and the stubborn hope that maybe, somehow she'd found her way back to him. The fire crackled, and shadows danced across the cabin walls like memories given form. Outside, the wind moaned through the aspens, carrying the scent of snow and something else, something that made him think of loneliness and long vigils. He'd chosen Silver Point because it was nowhere, because it was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to. But as he sat in the gathering darkness, Amos found himself thinking about the dog Martha had mentioned, the one that guarded a pile of snow with the devotion of a soldier at his post. Some things, he'd learned, were worth guarding. Some secrets were worth keeping, even if the reasons had been forgotten by everyone except the one doing the watching. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd take a walk through town and see what could inspire such loyalty in a creature that owed nothing to anyone. The fire burned low, and Amos banked the coals before settling onto the bed. Through the single window, he could see stars scattered across the sky like silver coins on black velvet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound of such pure loneliness that it might have been his own heart given voice. He pulled his blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes, but sleep was slow in coming. The cabin creaked and settled around him, and the wind continued its endless conversation with the trees. And beneath it all, like a bass note played on an instrument he couldn't name, was the feeling that he'd come to the right place for all the wrong reasons. The last thing he heard before sleep finally claimed him was another sound carried on the wind, the distant howl of a dog, mournful and persistent, as if calling to something that could never answer back. 3 days passed before curiosity got the better of caution. Amos had settled into a routine. Morning coffee by the fire, afternoons splitting wood or hunting small game, evenings reading by lamplight. The solitude suited him, but the mystery of the guarded snow pile nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. The dog appeared on his fourth morning in Silver Point, sitting at the edge of the clearing like a visitor waiting for an invitation. It was larger than most farm dogs, with the thick coat and erect ears of a husky mixed with something wilder. Its eyes were pale blue, almost white, and they studied Amos with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Well, hello there," Amos said softly, setting down his coffee cup. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move. "You're the one they told me about, aren't you? The Guardian." He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a piece of salt pork left over from breakfast. The dog's nostrils flared, but still it didn't approach. Amos tossed the meat halfway between them and stepped back. After a long moment, the animal padded forward, took the offering, and retreated to its original position. "Smart," Amos murmured. "Don't trust easy, do you?" "Can't say I blame you." The next morning brought the dog again, this time a few feet closer. Amos repeated the ritual with the salt pork, and again the animal accepted the gift with cautious dignity. By the third morning, the dog was sitting near enough that Amos could see the grey around its muzzle and the old scars that marked its hide. "You've seen some troubles, haven't you, boy?" Amos said, and this time the dog's tail moved once, a single wag like a flag of truce. "We all have, I suppose." On the seventh day, when grey clouds pressed low against the mountains and the air tasted of coming snow, the dog rose from its usual spot and walked directly to Amos. It sat at his feet and looked up at him with those pale eyes, then turned and walked a few steps toward town before stopping and looking back. "You want me to follow you?" Amos asked. The dog's tail wagged twice, deliberate as a signal. "All right then. Lead on." The walk to town took 20 minutes through snow that crunched under their feet like broken glass. The dog moved with purpose, never hurrying but never hesitating, as if it had made this journey many times before. As they approached the main street, Amos could see the old livery barn Martha had mentioned, a weathered structure that leaned slightly to one side. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Beside the barn sat a mound of snow, perhaps 4 feet high and twice as long. It looked natural enough, like snow that had drifted against an obstacle and been shaped by wind and weather. But as they drew closer, Amos could see it was too uniform, too deliberately placed. Someone had built this pile and maintained it, keeping it clear of debris and perfectly shaped. The dog stopped 10 feet from the mound and sat, watching Amos with expectant eyes. When he took a step closer, the animal didn't object. Another step, and another, until he stood directly beside the mysterious pile. "What are you hiding?" he asked, more to himself than to the dog. The animal whined once, soft and low, as if answering a question Amos hadn't known how to ask. He knelt and brushed away the top layer of snow with his gloved hands. Beneath was more snow, but it felt different, packed hard, almost like ice. He dug deeper, and his fingers struck something solid. Wood by the feel of it, smooth and worked by human hands. The dog moved closer now, sitting beside him as he worked. Its breath came in white puffs that mixed with his own, and occasionally it would whine or nudge his arm with its nose, as if encouraging him to continue. It took nearly an hour to clear away enough snow to reveal what lay beneath. A wooden strongbox, about the size of a traveling trunk, its brass fittings green with age. The wood was oak, well made and sealed with what looked like pine pitch. Someone had taken great care to protect whatever lay inside from the elements. Amos's hands trembled as he lifted the box from its snowy grave. It was heavier than he'd expected, and something rattled inside when he moved it. The dog watched intently as he carried the box to a nearby stump and set it down. The latch was stiff with cold and age, but it opened with a metallic click that seemed to echo across the empty street. Amos lifted the lid and felt the world tilt on its axis. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were letters, dozens of them tied with blue ribbon. Beneath the letters lay photographs, their edges brown with age, and at the bottom of the box, a leather-bound journal with a brass clasp, but it was the handwriting on the topmost letter that made his breath catch in his throat. Sarah McBride, written in the careful script he'd watched form 1,000 shopping lists and love notes. His hands shook as he lifted the letter, and the dog pressed against his leg as if offering comfort. The letter was addressed to him, Mr. Amos McBride, Millerville, Kansas, but it had never been mailed. The paper was yellowed but intact, protected by the oiled cloth and the careful burial. He opened it with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. "My dearest Amos," it began, "if you are reading this, then God has seen fit to bring you to the place where I found peace. I pray that he will grant you the same mercy he has shown me in these mountains." The words blurred as tears he'd held back for 30 years finally broke free. Sarah's voice seemed to speak from the page, as clear as if she were standing beside him. The dog whined softly and pressed closer, its warmth an anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I know you must think me cruel for leaving as I did," the letter continued. "I know you must have searched, must have wondered if I was dead or alive, or simply so heartless that I could abandon our love without explanation. The truth is more complicated than any of these, and I fear that when you learn it, you will understand why I could never come home." Amos sank onto the stump, the letter clutched in his hands. Around him, the world continued its business. Wind in the trees, the distant sound of a hammer from somewhere in town, the soft panting of the dog at his side. But he felt separated from it all, as if he'd fallen through a hole in time and landed in a place where the dead could speak. He read on, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird. Sarah wrote of traveling west, of finding Silver Point by accident when her stagecoach broke down. She wrote of the kindness of strangers and the slowly dawning realization that she could build a new life in this forgotten place. But she also wrote of guilt, crushing, unbearable guilt that followed her like a shadow. The guilt of a mother who couldn't save her child, of a wife who'd failed to comfort her grieving husband, of a woman who'd run from love because staying would have destroyed them both. "You were so strong after we lost Thomas," she wrote, "so determined to carry on, to be the rock I needed. But I could see how my grief wounded you, how my tears were like salt in your own wounds. I began to believe that I was a curse upon you, that everyone I loved was doomed to suffer for it." Amos closed his eyes, remembering those dark months after the funeral. He'd tried to be strong, tried to hold their marriage together through sheer force of will. But every day had been a battle against despair, and every night had brought dreams of his son's fever-bright eyes and Sarah's silent weeping. The journal lay at the bottom of the box like a sleeping serpent, promising answers to questions he'd carried for 30 years. But as he reached for it, the dog stood and walked a few steps away, then looked back at him with those pale, knowing eyes. The message was clear. Not here, not in the open where anyone might see. This discovery was too precious, too dangerous to expose to curious eyes. Whatever secrets Sarah had buried in this place, they deserved more dignity than a public revelation beside an abandoned barn. Amos carefully rewrapped the letters and photographs, closed the journal without opening it, and placed everything back in the strongbox. The dog watched approvingly as he lifted the box and began the walk back to his cabin, where the fire still burned and the shadows would protect Sarah's words from the judgment of the world. Behind them, the empty depression in the snow looked like a grave recently disturbed. The wind began to fill it with fresh powder, erasing the evidence of their discovery. But the truth, once uncovered, could never be buried again. The strongbox sat on his kitchen table like an accusation, its brass fittings catching the firelight and throwing shadows across the cabin walls. Amos had been staring at it for the better part of an hour, coffee growing cold in his cup, afraid to open it again. The dog, he'd started thinking of it as shadow, lay curled by the fire, occasionally lifting its head to watch him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. When he finally worked up the courage to lift the lid, His hands moved with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. The letters came out first, their blue ribbon as faded as a summer sky at twilight. Beneath them lay photographs he'd been too shocked to examine properly, and at the bottom, Sarah's journal waited like a book of prophecy he wasn't sure he wanted to read. The photographs drew his attention first. The top one showed a woman he almost didn't recognize. Sarah, but changed. Her face was thinner, marked by lines that spoke of hard choices and harder winters. She stood before a small wooden building with Silver Point School painted above the door, surrounded by children of various ages. Her smile was different too, gentler somehow. As if sorrow had taught her new ways to find joy, she became a teacher, he thought, studying the careful way she held her shoulders, the protective angle of her arms around the smallest children. Sarah had always been good with youngsters, patient in ways that amazed him. Before Thomas was born, she talked about having a classroom full of children, about shaping young minds and watching them grow. He set the photograph aside and reached for the journal, then stopped. The weight of 30 years pressed down on him like a physical thing. Whatever truths lay within those pages would change everything he thought he knew about his wife, about their marriage, about the woman who'd shared his bed and his dreams, but ignorance was no longer an option. He opened the journal to its first entry. April 15th, 1895. I have arrived in a place called Silver Point, high in the Colorado mountains. The stagecoach broke an axle 20 miles east of here, and the driver says it will be days before another comes through. Perhaps it is God's way of telling me to stop running. The people here are kind, but wary. I cannot blame them. I must look like what I am, a woman fleeing something terrible. Mrs. Kellerton at the general store has given me a room above her establishment in exchange for help with the books. It is more charity than I deserve. Amos paused, his thumb tracing the careful loops of Sarah's handwriting. Mrs. Kellerton. That would be Martha, the woman who'd rented him the cabin. She'd known Sarah, had helped her. The realization made him feel exposed, as if everyone in Silver Point had been watching him since his arrival, measuring him against memories of his wife. April 20th, 1895. I have been here 5 days now, and still the stagecoach has not come. Part of me hopes it never will. There is something peaceful about this place, something that makes the weight in my chest feel lighter. The children here have no proper school. Their teacher left when the mine closed, and I find myself helping them with their letters when their parents bring them to the store. Little Mary. Henley asked me today why I look so sad. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that some sadnesses become part of you, like scars that never quite heal? I told her I was thinking of someone far away, and she said that if I stayed in Silver Point, maybe the sadness would get smaller. Children have a wisdom that adults forget. The name Henley struck him. This was the cabin he was renting, the place where Tom Henley had lived until his death last spring. The connections between past and present seemed to multiply with each page. As if fate had been weaving a tapestry, he was only now learning to read. May the 1st, 1895, the stagecoach finally came. But I could not bring myself to board it. Mrs. Kellerton says the position of schoolteacher is mine if I want it. The salary is small, but my needs are smaller. I sent word to the stage company that my ticket should be given to someone more deserving. I wrote a letter to Amos today, but could not bring myself to send it. How do you tell a man that his wife has decided to become someone else? How do you explain that love sometimes means having the courage to let go? Amos closed the journal and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered clearing. Shadow padded over and pressed against his leg, offering the silent comfort that animals understood better than most humans. Through the glass, he could see the lights of Silver Point twinkling in the valley below, and he wondered how many secrets lay buried in that small collection of buildings. The photograph of Sarah with the schoolchildren drew his eyes again. In it, she wore a simple dress he didn't recognize, her hair pinned back in a style she'd never worn during their marriage. But it was her expression that haunted him, peaceful in a way he'd never seen her, even in their happiest moments. She found something here, he realized. something she couldn't find with me. The thought should have filled him with anger, but instead he felt only a deep, aching sadness. Their love had been real. He'd never doubted that. But perhaps love alone hadn't been enough to heal the wounds that Thomas's death had carved in both their hearts. He returned to the journal, turning the pages carefully. May 15th, 1895. I have been teaching for 2 weeks now, and I am surprised by how much joy it brings me. The children are eager to learn, hungry for the knowledge that education can provide. When I see their faces light up as they master a new concept, I feel something I had thought lost forever. Hope. There are 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Most are children of miners who stayed behind when the silver played out, too poor to leave and too proud to admit defeat. They deserve better than this forgotten place can offer them, but perhaps I can help prepare them for the wider world. Tom Henley's daughter Mary is my brightest pupil. She has her father's gentle nature and her late mother's quick mind. When she reads aloud, her voice reminds me of wind chimes on a summer evening. Mary Henley, the same little girl who had asked about Sarah's sadness, was now a woman grown, probably with children of her own. Time had a way of folding in on itself, Amos reflected, connecting moments across decades in ways that seem miraculous or cruel, depending on your perspective. June 3rd, 1895. I dreamed of Thomas again last night. In the dream, he was healthy and laughing, running through a field of wildflowers, while Amos and I watched from the porch of a house I've never seen. When I woke, I felt neither sadness nor guilt, only gratitude for the gift of seeing my son happy, even if only in sleep. Perhaps this is healing, not the forgetting of pain, but the transformation of it into something that can coexist with joy. The children here have taught me that loss does not have to mean the end of love, only its evolution into new forms. Amos set the journal aside and walked back to the fire, where Shadow waited with patient eyes. The dog seemed to understand the weight of revelation, the way truth could be both blessing and burden. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the clearing. He thought about the man he'd been 30 years ago, younger, more certain of his ability to fix what was broken, to will his way through any obstacle. That man would have raged at Sarah's decision to disappear, would have seen it as betrayal pure and simple. But time had taught him that some wounds cut too deep for simple healing, that sometimes love meant having the wisdom to step back and let the beloved find their own path to peace. Still, questions remained. If Sarah had found happiness in Silver Point, if she'd built a new life among these mountain people, why had she never sent word? Why leave him to wander and search and slowly go mad with not knowing? The answers lay in the journal, he knew, but for tonight he'd learned enough. Some truths were too large to swallow all at once. Morning brought fresh snow and fresh courage. Amos woke to find Shadow sitting by the door, tail wagging with what looked like anticipation. The dog had spent the night curled by the fire, as if it understood that the cabin had become a sacred space where memories were being resurrected. "You want to go back to town, don't you?" Amos asked, pulling on his boots. Shadow's ears perked up, and it padded to the strongbox on the table, looking back at him meaningfully. "All right then, but we're taking this with us. Whatever secrets it holds, they're safer with me than buried in the snow." The walk to Silver Point felt different this time, weighted with purpose. Amos carried the strongbox under one arm, its contents shifting slightly with each step. Shadow trotted beside him, occasionally ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents before returning to his side like a faithful sentinel. In daylight, the town revealed details he'd missed during his first visit. Behind the general store stood a small white building with a bell tower, the schoolhouse where Sarah had taught. The windows were boarded now, but he could imagine them filled with lamplight and the eager faces of children hungry for learning. Martha Kellerton looked up as he entered the store, her eyes immediately finding the strongbox under his arm. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, recognition perhaps, or resignation. "Found something interesting during your walks?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "You could say that." Amos set the box on the counter between them. "I'm guessing you know what this is." Martha's fingers traced the edge of the counter, her gaze fixed on the weathered wood of the strongbox. "Sarah's things. She asked me to help her bury it before she got too sick to manage it herself. Said someone might come looking someday, someone who'd know what to do with it. You knew her well as anyone could know Sarah McBride." Martha's voice carried the weight of old affection and older grief. She was a private woman but kind. The children loved her something fierce. When she took sick 3 winters back, half the town sat vigil at her bedside. 3 winters back. The timeline hit Amos like a physical blow. While he'd been living his quiet life in Kansas, assuming Sarah long dead, she'd been dying here among strangers who'd become family. The thought filled him with a guilt so sharp it took his breath away. She never married again? Martha shook her head. Had offers. Tom Henley was sweet on her for years, but she always said her heart belonged to someone else, someone she couldn't have, but couldn't forget either. The bell above the door chimed, and a man entered, tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. Martha's expression brightened slightly. "Pete Garrison, meet Amos McBride." "Amos, this is Pete. He runs what passes for a saloon in this town." Pete extended a calloused hand. "Any relation to the Sarah McBride who used to teach here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Amos found himself at a crossroads. He could lie, claim coincidence, and keep his grief private. Or he could speak the truth and open himself to questions he wasn't sure he could. "Answer, she was my wife," he said. Finally, Pete's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, compassion mixed with what might have been relief. "Well, I'll be damned. She used to talk about you, you know, called you her Amos, like you were something precious she'd lost and hoped to find again." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Amos gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. "She talked about me? More in the last year, when the sickness was taking hold. She'd sit by my fire in the evenings. I served as town doctor when we couldn't afford a real one. And she'd tell stories about a man back in Kansas who could track a deer through snow, who made her laugh even when times were hard." Pete glanced at the strongbox, then back at Amos. "She said once that leaving you was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but staying would have been harder. Said you both needed to heal in your own ways, and sometimes healing meant being apart." Martha nodded slowly. "Sarah never stopped loving you, Mr. McBride, but she carried a guilt that ate at her like acid. She blamed herself for your boy's death, thought she was cursed to lose everyone she loved. When she found peace here, she was afraid to reach out, afraid she'd bring that curse back into your life." Amos opened the strongbox with trembling hands and pulled out one of the photographs, the one that had caught his attention the night before. But now he noticed something he'd missed. Tucked behind the school children was a hand-drawn picture, obviously the work of a child. It showed a woman with long hair standing beside a group of stick figures. And across the bottom, in careful block letters, someone had written, "Mama Sarah." "She became a mother to them," Martha said softly, seeing his discovery. "Not by blood, but by choice. After the mine collapse of '96, there were orphans left behind. Sarah took them in, all of them. Fed them, taught them, loved them like they were her own." The drawing wavered in Amos's vision as tears he'd held back for decades finally broke free. This was why Sarah had stayed, why she'd built a new life in this forgotten place. She'd found a way to channel her maternal love into something healing, both for herself and for children who needed her. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "7 at the most," Pete replied. They grew up and moved on, started families of their own. But they all came back to visit her, brought their own children to meet the woman who'd saved them. She had grandchildren in a way, a whole generation who called her Grandma Sarah. The image shifted Amos's understanding of his wife's disappearance. This hadn't been abandonment, it had been transformation. Sarah had taken the love meant for the child they'd lost and given it to children who desperately needed it. She'd become exactly what she was meant to be, just not in the way either of them had expected. "There's more you should know," Martha said gently. Sarah kept every letter you wrote to her, the ones you sent to her sister in Missouri, asking for news. Emma forwarded them here. Sarah read them over and over, but she never felt worthy of answering them. I wrote to Emma for years, Amos said, remembering the careful letters, the hope that gradually faded with each unanswered query. She never told me. Sarah made her promise, said it was kinder to let you think her dead than to keep alive a hope that could never be fulfilled. Martha's voice carried decades of held secrets. But she kept every word you wrote, treasured them like prayers. Pete cleared his throat. There's something else. Sarah asked me to tell you something, if you ever came looking. She said to tell you that loving you was the best part of her life, and that building a new life here was the second best. She said, he paused, gathering courage. She said that some loves are too big for one lifetime, that maybe in the next world you'd have all the time you needed to get it right. Shadow whined softly from his position by the door, as if sensing the weight of revelation that hung in the air. Amos reached down to stroke the dog's head, needing the comfort of something warm and alive and present. The dog, he said suddenly. It knew her, didn't it? Martha smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. That's her shadow. She found him half dead in a snowstorm, nursed him back to health. He's been guarding her things ever since she passed, waiting for someone who'd understand what they meant. The pieces fell into place, like a puzzle finally solved. The dog's instant acceptance of him, its knowledge of where the strongbox lay buried, its patient vigil beside graves that held more than snow. Shadow had been waiting not for anyone, but for him specifically, the one person who would understand the true value of what lay hidden beneath the surface. Back in the cabin that evening, Amos sat with the strongbox open before him like an altar of memory. The wind outside had quieted to whispers, and Shadow lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head when Amos turned a page or drew a sharp breath at some particularly painful revelation. He'd been putting off reading Sarah's journal in earnest, afraid of what deeper truths it might contain. But the conversations with Martha and Pete had prepared him somewhat, had given context to the choices his wife had made. Now he felt ready to hear Sarah's voice speaking directly to him across the years. The journal's middle pages held entries from Sarah's second year in Silver Point, when she'd begun to truly make the town her home. Her handwriting had grown more confident, the cramped, careful letters of her early entries giving way to flowing script that spoke of someone finding her natural rhythm. September 12th, 1896. The mine collapse yesterday has changed everything. 17 men dead, including 4 fathers of my students. The whole town grieves as one, but it is the children's grief that cuts deepest. Little Samuel Morrison, only 8 years old, keeps asking when his papa will come home from the mountain. How do you explain death to a child who still believes in the fundamental fairness of the world? I have decided to take in the Morrison children, Samuel and his sister Lucy. Their mother died in childbirth 2 years ago, and they have no other family. Mrs. Kellerton thinks I'm taking on too much, but I cannot bear the thought of them going to the Territorial Orphanage in Denver. They need stability now, not more upheaval. Amos paused, imagining Sarah making such a momentous decision with the same quiet determination she'd once brought to their household management. She'd always been the one to take in stray cats and injured birds, nursing them back to health with patience that amazed him. October 1st, 1896, Samuel has begun calling me Mama Sarah, and the sound breaks my heart in the most beautiful way. It's not that I am trying to replace his mother. No one could do that. But he needs someone to be his anchor in this storm of loss. And I find that I need to be needed in ways I had forgotten. Lucy is more reserved, watching me with careful eyes, as if testing whether I can be trusted with her brother's affection. She remembers her mother more clearly than Samuel does, and I think she sees my care for them as somehow disloyal to that memory. Time will tell if I can earn her trust. The entry was followed by several pages that made Amos's chest tight with recognition. Sarah wrote about sleepless nights when the children cried for their father, about learning to braid Lucy's hair the way her mother had, about teaching Samuel to whittle small animals from scraps of wood. The daily details of parenthood that she'd been denied with Thomas, but had found again with these orphaned souls. December 24th, 1896. Our first Christmas as a family, strange to write those words, but true nonetheless. Lucy helped me make cookies using her mother's recipe, which she remembered with startling precision. Samuel carved a wooden star for the top of our small tree, his tongue poking out in concentration, just like Thomas used to do when he was trying to master something difficult. I wrapped the few gifts I could afford and placed them under the tree, then sat by the fire watching my children sleep. Yes, I think of them as mine now, though I pray their father's spirit understands and forgives my presumption. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt something approaching contentment. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of that crushing weight that used to make it hard to breathe. I wrote a letter to Amos tonight, as I do every Christmas Eve. I tell him about the snow, about the children, about how the mountains look in moonlight. I never send these letters, but writing them makes me feel less alone. Sometimes I imagine him reading them by our old fireplace in Kansas, and for a moment I can pretend that the distance between us is measured in miles rather than broken promises. Amos set the journal aside and walked to the cabin's single window. Outside, the snow fell in fat flakes that caught the lamplight like fragments of fallen stars. Somewhere in this very strongbox were those unsent Christmas letters, 30 years' worth of love with nowhere to go. He found them in a separate bundle, tied with a different ribbon, red instead of blue. The dates on the envelopes confirmed what he'd suspected: December 24th, 1895, 1896, 1897, continuing unbroken through 1924, the year Sarah had died. 30 Christmas letters, each one addressed to him in her careful script. Each one sealed but never mailed. His hands shook as he opened the first one. My dearest Amos, tonight the snow falls on Silver Point like a blessing, covering the rough edges of this place and making it beautiful. I wonder if it is snowing in Kansas, if you are sitting by our old fireplace, thinking of Christmases past. Do you remember the year Thomas was born, how we stayed up all night just watching him sleep? I carry that memory like a candle in my heart. It lights the dark places and keeps hope alive. I have found a measure of peace here, but it is not the peace of forgetting. Rather, it is the peace of learning to carry love and loss together, like a woman carrying water in cupped hands. Some spills, but what remains is precious beyond measure. I pray that you have found your own peace, that you have learned to forgive me for the pain my leaving caused. Most of all, I pray that you have always known, that my love for you was real and remains real, even across this distance that seems to grow wider with each passing year. Always yours. Sarah, the letter blurred as tears that had been building for 30 years finally found their release. Amos sank into his chair and wept, for Sarah, for Thomas, for the children who'd called her Mama Sarah, for all the years they'd lost to pride and fear and the terrible belief that love meant never causing pain. Shadow rose from his place by the fire and padded over, resting his great head on Amos's knee. The dog's eyes held a depth of understanding that seemed almost human, as if he too had carried the weight of unfinished conversations and undelivered messages. She loved us both, didn't she? Amos whispered, stroking the animal's thick fur. Loved us enough to let us go, but not enough to forget us. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with renewed force. But inside the cabin, surrounded by Sarah's words and warmed by the presence of her faithful companion, Amos felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades, the possibility of peace. There were more letters to read, more journal entries to absorb. But for tonight, it was enough to know that Sarah had thought of him every Christmas, had kept their love alive in the only way available to her. The knowledge didn't erase the pain of their separation, but it transformed it into something bearable, something that could coexist with gratitude for what they'd shared. He carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope, then gathered up the journal and the remaining Christmas letters. Tomorrow, He would continue reading, would learn more about the woman Sarah had become in this mountain town. But tonight, he would simply sit by the fire with her dog and let himself feel loved across the impossible distance of time and death. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks they'd made earlier, erasing the evidence of their journey while preserving the destination. In the morning, the world would be clean and white and full of possibility. But for now, in the warm circle of lamplight, the past and present existed in perfect, painful harmony. The next morning brought Eleanor Hartley to his door. She was a woman of perhaps 70, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes the color of winter sky. Shadow's tail began wagging the moment he saw her, and she bent to scratch behind his ears with the familiarity of long friendship. "You must be Amos," she said, studying his face with the same intensity Martha had shown. "Sarah spoke of you often, said you had kind eyes and stubborn chin. She was right on both counts. Mrs. Hartley, Eleanor, please. I was Sarah's dearest friend in this place, and I've been watching you since you arrived, waiting for the right moment to introduce myself." She gestured toward the strongbox, visible through the open doorway. "I see Shadow led you to her treasures." Amos stepped aside to let her enter. Eleanor moved through the cabin with the confidence of someone who'd visited often, settling into the chair by the fire as if it had been made for her. Shadow curled up at her feet, and she reached down to stroke his head absently. "Sarah asked me to look after Shadow when she passed," Eleanor said. "But more than that, she asked me to look after her memories until someone came who could appreciate their true value. I've been waiting 3 years for you to find your way here. She knew I'd come? Hoped more than knew. Sarah was a woman who believed in the power of love to transcend distance and death. She said love had its own gravity, that eventually it would pull the separated pieces back together." Eleanor's eyes found the bundle of Christmas letters on the table. "She wrote to you every year, you know. Not just at Christmas, but on your birthday, your wedding anniversary, the day Thomas was born." The revelation hit Amos like a physical blow. "There are more letters?" Eleanor nodded toward the strongbox. "Look in the bottom compartment." Sarah had the box specially made with a false bottom. She wanted to be sure her most precious things stayed safe. With trembling fingers, Amos examined the box more carefully. What he'd taken for solid wood gave way under pressure, revealing a hidden space containing dozens more letters. Birthday wishes spanning 3 decades. Anniversary remembrances filled with shared memories. Letters written on the anniversary of Thomas's birth and death, each one a meditation on love and loss and the courage required to keep living. Why didn't she send them? The question came out as barely a whisper. "Fear," Eleanor said simply. "Fear that you'd moved on, found happiness with someone else. Fear that her letters would reopen wounds that had finally healed. But mostly fear that you'd come for her, and she'd have to choose between the life she'd built here and the love she'd never stopped carrying." Eleanor rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Sarah found peace in Silver Point, but it was a fragile thing, built on the belief that she was doing penance for Thomas's death. She convinced herself that staying away from you was a sacrifice that honored his memory, that her suffering somehow balanced the scales of cosmic justice. "That's not—" Amos began, then stopped. He remembered his own dark thoughts after the funeral, the way he'd blamed himself for not being a better father, for not somehow preventing the fever that took their son. Grief made people irrational, made them believe they could trade their happiness for the impossible return of what was lost. "She kept your photograph on her bedside table," Eleanor continued. "The one from your wedding day, where you're both trying so hard not to laugh at something the photographer said. In her final weeks, when the fever made her delirious, she'd talk to that photograph like you were right there in the room with her." Amos pulled out one of the anniversary letters, dated 5 years earlier. Sarah's handwriting was shakier by then, betraying the illness that would eventually claim her. "My beloved Amos, 25 years ago today. We stood before God and promised to love each other through whatever trials life might bring. I have failed in so many ways to honor that promise, but I want you to know that my love for you has never wavered. Not for a single day. I dream sometimes that I have the courage to board a train heading east, that I surprise you at our old house in Kansas. In these dreams, you forgive my long absence, and we spend our remaining years making up for lost time. But then I wake, and the weight of all I've done and failed to do settles on me like snow on a grave. The children here keep me grounded in the present. Lucy has grown into a fine young woman and married the blacksmith's son. Samuel joined the army and writes to me from his post in California. They call me grandmother now, and their children climb on my lap and demand stories. I tell them about a brave man in Kansas who taught me that love is not possession but freedom, not holding tight but letting go. I pray that wherever you are, whatever path your life has taken, you have found the happiness that my cowardice denied us both. You deserved so much better than a wife who ran when courage was required. Forever yours, Sarah. She never remarried, Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. Tom Henley proposed twice, and he was a good man who would have cherished her. But Sarah said her heart had room for only one great love, and that space belonged to you until the day she died. Amos set the letter aside and looked at Eleanor with eyes that felt raw from crying. Tell me about her last days, please. Eleanor's expression softened. She faced death the way she faced everything else, with quiet dignity and concern for others. Her last coherent words were instructions about caring for Shadow and preserving her letters. She made me promise to bury the strongbox where Shadow could guard it, said that if you ever came looking, he'd know what to do, and if I'd never come, then her secrets would have stayed buried. Sarah believed that some truths were too precious to risk exposing to the wrong eyes. But she also believed that love had its own wisdom, that it would guide the right person to the right place at the right time. Eleanor rose and moved to the door. There's something else you should see. The schoolhouse where Sarah taught. It's been empty since she died, but her classroom is exactly as she left it. The town council couldn't bring themselves to disturb anything. Would you like me to show it to you? Amos nodded, not trusting his voice. He gathered up the letters and journal, tucked them safely back in the strongbox, and followed Eleanor into the cold morning air. Shadow trotted beside them, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town like a monument to vanished dreams. Eleanor produced a key from her coat pocket and unlocked the door, which opened with a creak that spoke of long disuse. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that filtered through dirty windows. Sarah's desk sat at the front of the room, its surface still covered with her teaching materials. A chalkboard behind it bore the faint ghost of her final lesson, something about the water cycle that had never been erased. Children's artwork decorated the walls, their bright colors faded but still recognizable as the efforts of young hands guided by a patient teacher. She loved this place, Eleanor said softly. Said it was where she learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, but finding ways to honor it while building something new. Amos walked slowly among the empty desks, imagining them filled with eager faces. On Sarah's desk, he found a teaching certificate bearing her name and the official seal of the Colorado Territory. Beside it lay a small wooden frame containing a photograph he'd never seen. Sarah surrounded by her students, all of them grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of the life Sarah had built in his absence, Amos finally understood the choice she'd made. She hadn't left him for another man or another dream. She'd left to become the person their shared grief had prevented her from being, to find a way to transform their loss into something that could nurture and protect others. It wasn't abandonment. It was metamorphosis. That evening, Amos sat alone in the cabin with Sarah's journal open to its final entries. Eleanor had left him with a promise to return the next day, sensing that he needed time to absorb the magnitude of what he'd learned. Shadow lay by the fire, occasionally lifting his head when the wind rattled the windows or when Amos drew a sharp breath at some particularly poignant passage. The journal's later entries showed a different Sarah, one who found peace with her choices but struggled with the approaching reality of death. Her handwriting grew shakier as the months progressed, but her voice remained strong, filled with the wisdom that comes from a life fully lived, despite its compromises. March 15th, 1924, Dr. Garrison says the consumption will likely take me before summer's end. Strange how facing death clarifies what truly matters. I find myself thinking not of regrets, but of gratitudes. Grateful for the children who called me mother, for the students who taught me as much as I taught them, for this mountain town that gave me sanctuary when I needed it most. But my deepest gratitude is for Amos, for the years we had together, for the love that sustained me even across this terrible distance. I pray that someday he will understand that leaving him was not betrayal, but the deepest expression of love I could manage. I was broken when I came here, and I feared that staying with him would have broken us both. Amos paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The journal felt heavy in his lap, weighted with more than paper and ink. As he turned the page, something crinkled between the leaves, a piece of paper that had been carefully inserted into the binding. He pulled it free and unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a birth certificate, the official seal of Colorado Territory, clearly visible despite the paper's age. The child's name stopped his heart: Emma Rose McBride. Mother Sarah Elizabeth McBride. Father Amos Daniel McBride. Date of birth November 3rd, 1895. The paper fluttered from his nerveless fingers to the floor. Shadow immediately rose and nosed at it, whining softly as if sensing the magnitude of the revelation. Amos stared at the certificate, his mind reeling with implications that seemed too large to process. Sarah had been pregnant when she left him, pregnant and afraid, carrying his child into an uncertain future rather than risk burdening him with another life that might be lost to illness or accident. The dates aligned perfectly. If Emma had been born in November of 1895, Sarah would have been in the early stages of pregnancy when she disappeared in March. With shaking hands, he picked up the birth certificate and returned to the journal, searching frantically for any mention of this daughter he'd never known existed. The entries from late 1895 had been sparse, and now he understood why. Sarah had been dealing with pregnancy alone, in a strange place, while grieving the loss of their son and the abandonment of their marriage. He found the first reference several pages later. In an entry dated December 1895, Emma arrived this morning, healthy and beautiful and utterly perfect. Mrs. Kellerton assisted with the birth, and her steady presence kept me from drowning in terror. When I held my daughter for the first time, I felt a joy so pure it nearly broke my heart. She has Amos's eyes and his stubborn chin, and when she grasps my finger, I can almost believe that love is stronger than loss. I named her Emma for my grandmother, and Rose for the hope that she represents, the possibility of new life growing from the ashes of old pain. She will never know her father, and the weight of that knowledge sits on my chest like a stone. But perhaps it is better this way. Perhaps she will be spared the curse that seems to follow those I love. The words blurred as Amos struggled to process the reality of a daughter he'd never held. Never known, never had the chance to lose or love or protect. Sarah had carried this secret for the rest of her life, had raised their child alone. While he searched for her across half the country, he turned the pages desperately, looking for more mentions of Emma. They came in scattered fragments, descriptions of first steps and first words, of bedtime stories and scraped knees. Sarah wrote about Emma's quick mind and gentle nature, about the way she cared for the other children Sarah had taken in. June 12, 1897, Emma is walking now, toddling around the cabin with the determination of someone who has important places to go. She follows me everywhere, chattering in the language that only mothers and children understand. When I read to the other children in the evenings, she sits in my lap and turns the pages, already showing the love of books that marked both her parents. I caught her playing with a wooden horse that Tom Henley carved for her, and for a moment I could see Amos so clearly in her movements, in the way she concentrated on making the toy gallop across the floor. The resemblance is so strong sometimes that it takes my breath away. She's her father's daughter in ways that both comfort and torment me. But as Amos read on, a terrible pattern began to emerge. Emma's mentions grew less frequent in the journal, and when they appeared, they carried undertones of worry that made his stomach clench with dread. September 8th, 1898. Emma has been feverish for 3 days now. Dr. Garrison says it's the same consumption that took the Miller boy last winter. I sit by her bedside and read the same stories over and over, hoping that the sound of my voice will anchor her to this world. She's so small, so fragile, and I'm haunted by memories of Thomas in his final days. I have prayed until my knees are raw, have bargained with God in ways that shame me. If this is punishment for my cowardice, then let it fall on me alone. Emma is innocent of her mother's sins. She deserves the chance to grow up, to know love, to make her own choices about what to keep and what to leave behind. The final entry about Emma was dated October 15th, 1898. My daughter went to sleep in my arms this morning and did not wake up. The same fever that took Thomas has claimed Emma, and I'm left to wonder if I am truly cursed to lose every child I dare to love. She was 3 years old enough to laugh and run and fill a room with sunlight, young enough to still believe in magic and happy endings. I buried her in the small cemetery behind the church. Next to the other children this place has lost. Tom Henley carved a beautiful headstone with angels and flowers, and the whole town came to pay their respects. They all loved her. How could they not? She was joy made manifest, love given form. I will not write of this again. The pain is too great, and there are other children here who need me to be strong. But I want these words to exist somewhere, so that if Amos ever finds this record, he will know that we had a daughter, and that she was beautiful, and that she knew she was loved, even if she never knew her father's name. Amos set the journal aside and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape without seeing it. A daughter? He'd had a daughter named Emma Rose, and she'd lived for 3 precious years before the same disease that claimed Thomas took her as well. Sarah had carried this grief alone, had buried their child without him there to share the weight of loss. The magnitude of what Sarah had endured staggered him. Not only had she lost Thomas, but she'd carried and raised and lost another child, all while maintaining her strength for the orphans who depended on her. The woman he'd known had been strong, but this level of endurance spoke to reserves of courage he'd never fully appreciated. Shadow padded over and pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. The dog's loyalty suddenly took on new dimensions. He hadn't just been guarding Sarah's secrets, but the memory of a child who'd probably played with him, laughed at his antics, fallen asleep against his warm fur. You knew her too, didn't you? Amos whispered, kneeling to embrace the animal. You loved them both, Sarah and Emma, and when they were gone, you kept watch over their memory. The wind outside seemed to carry voices, the laughter of children long dead, the whispered prayers of mothers who'd lost everything, but somehow found the strength to keep going. In this cabin, surrounded by the evidence of Sarah's secret life, Amos finally understood the true depth of the sacrifice she'd made. She hadn't just left him, she'd chosen to bear their daughter alone, to raise her alone, to lose her alone, all because she'd believed that her presence in his life would bring only more pain. The guilt that had driven her away had been compounded by the fear that she was somehow responsible for the deaths of their children. That love itself was dangerous when it flowed through her. As he held Shadow close and let the tears come, Amos realized that tomorrow he would have to visit another grave, not just Sarah's, but Emma's as well. He would have to stand over the resting place of a daughter he'd never known, and find a way to grieve for a future that had been stolen before it began. Sleep did not come easily that night. Amos lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while shadows from the dying fire danced across the rough-hewn beams. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a little girl with his chin and Sarah's grace, toddling around this very cabin with the fearless joy that only children possess. Emma Rose McBride, a name he whispered into the darkness like a prayer for the dead. Shadow sensed his restlessness and padded over from his usual spot by the fire. settling his warm bulk against Amos's side. The dog's presence provided an anchor in the storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Here was a living connection to both Sarah and the daughter he'd never known, a faithful guardian who'd witnessed their joys and sorrows firsthand. When morning finally came, grey and cold and heavy with the promise of snow, Amos rose with the weight of purpose settling on his shoulders. He had reading left to do. Sarah's journal contained entries that stretched beyond Emma's death, chronicling the years when she'd somehow found the strength to continue teaching and caring for other children, despite carrying such devastating loss. Eleanor arrived just after breakfast, her cheeks red from the cold and her arms full of what looked like letters and photographs. Shadow greeted her with obvious affection, and she paused to scratch behind his ears before settling into the chair by the fire. "I couldn't sleep either," she said without preamble. "Kept thinking about what you must be going through, learning about Emma." Her eyes found the birth certificate, which Amos had left on the table beside Sarah's journal. "She never told you, did she? About the baby?" "Not a word." Amos's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "I spent 30 years thinking she'd simply abandoned our marriage. I never imagined she was carrying my child when she left." Eleanor nodded sadly. "Sarah was convinced that telling you would only cause more pain. She said you'd blame yourself for not protecting her, for not somehow knowing she was pregnant. She thought the guilt would destroy you the way it was destroying her. The guilt destroyed her anyway." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "The guilt wounded her, but it didn't destroy her. Emma gave her 3 years of joy that helped heal the worst of those wounds. And the children she cared for afterward, they completed the healing. Sarah found a way to transform her losses into love for others. That's not destruction, that's redemption." She opened the bundle she'd brought and spread its contents on the table. More photographs, these showing Sarah with various children over the years. In some she held babies, in others she stood surrounded by school-age children with books in their hands and wonder in their eyes. But in all of them, despite the lines that grief had carved around her eyes, Sarah looked genuinely happy. "These were in her desk at the schoolhouse," Eleanor explained. "I thought you should see how she lived, not just how she died." Amos picked up a photograph dated 1910, showing Sarah with a group of teenagers at what looked like a graduation ceremony. She wore a dark dress with a small brooch at her throat, the same brooch he'd given her for their first wedding anniversary. Even after all those years, she'd kept something of their life together. "Tell me about her final months," he said. "I need to understand what she was thinking, what she was hoping for." Eleanor's expression grew distant, as if she were looking back through the years to that painful time. The consumption came on slowly at first. Sarah tried to hide it, kept teaching even when she could barely stand at the blackboard. It was only when she started coughing up blood that Dr. Garrison forced her to rest. She pointed to another photograph, this one showing Sarah in bed, surrounded by former students who'd come to visit. Despite her obvious illness, she was smiling, her hands clasped around those of a young woman who might have been Lucy Morrison, all grown up. "She spent her last months writing," Eleanor continued. "Not just the journal entries you've been reading, but letters to all the children she'd raised over the years. She wanted each of them to have something to remember her by, some words of wisdom to carry forward." And the letter to Emma. Eleanor's breath caught. "You found that too?" Amos nodded, though he hadn't actually discovered such a letter yet. But if Sarah had written to all her other children, it stood to reason she'd have written something for the daughter who died so young. "It's in the hidden compartment," Eleanor said softly. "Sarah wrote it during her final week when the fever was making her delirious. She kept asking for Emma, saying she needed to explain why Mama had to go away again. With trembling fingers, Amos searched the secret compartment until he found a sealed envelope marked with a single word, Emma. The paper was different from the others. Newer, softer, as if Sarah had saved her finest stationery for this most precious correspondence. Inside was a letter written in the shaky hand of someone fighting both illness and overwhelming emotion. "My precious Emma, Mama is going to sleep soon, the kind of sleep that lasts until heaven calls us home. I wanted to write you a letter before I go, so that someday, when your papa finds these words, he'll know how much we both loved you. You were the light of my days, little star. Even when you were fussing or getting into mischief, you made every moment brighter just by being in it. When you laughed, the whole world seemed to laugh with you. When you cried, my heart broke and mended itself a dozen times over. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from the sickness that took you. I'm sorry you never got to meet your papa, who would have loved you more than all the stars in the sky. He has kind eyes and strong hands, and he would have carried you on his shoulders and taught you to track deer through the snow. I want you to know that losing you didn't make me love you less. It made me love you more, in all the ways that mothers love children who grow up in their hearts instead of in their arms. Every child I've taught, every orphan I've held, has been loved with some part of the love I couldn't give to you. Watch over your papa when he reads this. He's going to hurt the way I hurt when you left us, and he'll need someone to remind him that love doesn't end with death. It just changes shape. Help him understand that some goodbyes are not abandonment, but transformation. Give Thomas my love when you see him. Tell him Mama and Papa never stopped missing him, never stopped wishing we could have saved him. Tell him we learned to carry our love for both of you, like a flame that never goes out, warming us even in the coldest winters, all my love. Until we meet again, Mama. By the time Amos finished reading, tears were streaming down his face unchecked. Elena reached over and took his hand, her own eyes bright with unshed emotion. She died 2 days after writing that, Elena said quietly. I was with her at the end. Her last coherent words were about you. She said to tell you that waiting 30 years for you to find her was nothing compared to eternity, that she'd wait forever, if necessary. Amos folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. Through the cabin's single window, he could see the cemetery where Sarah and Emma lay buried, their graves marked by simple stone crosses that spoke of lives lived quietly but with profound impact. I need to see them, he said. Both graves. I need to... His voice broke and he struggled to find words for what he needed. To apologize, to say goodbye, to somehow bridge the gap between the father he'd been and the father he should have been. Of course, Eleanor said. But first, there's something else you should know. Sarah asked me to give you this, if you ever came. She reached into her coat and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by handling. She carved it herself during the long nights when Emma was sick, said it was the only gift she could give you that came from her hands alone. Inside the box lay a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. When Amos opened it, he found 2 tiny photographs, one of Thomas as a baby, the other of Emma at perhaps 2 years old. Both children had his eyes and Sarah's gentle smile, and seeing them together, siblings who'd never met in life, made his chest tight with emotion. She wore it every day until she died, Eleanor said. Said it kept you all close to her heart, even across the distance. Amos closed the locket and slipped the chain over his head, feeling the weight of it settle against his chest like a blessing. For the first time in 30 years, he carried images of his children close to his heart, united at last in the only way that remained possible. I'm ready now, he said, rising from his chair, to see where they rest, to say the words I should have said years ago. Eleanor nodded and reached for her coat. Shadow will want to come. He visits Sarah's grave every day, sometimes Emma's too. I think he's been waiting for you to join him, to help him understand that watching over the dead is something we do together. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Amos took one last look around the space that had become a sanctuary for Sarah's memories. The journal lay open on the table, its pages filled with the careful record of a life lived with courage despite crushing loss. The photographs showed the faces of children who'd called her mother, students who'd looked to her for guidance, a community that had embraced her as family. This was Sarah's true legacy, not the woman who'd fled in terror and guilt, but the one who'd transformed her pain into purpose, her loss into love for others. She'd become the mother she was meant to be, just not in the way either of them had expected. Now it was time to visit the place where that journey had ended, where Sarah and Emma waited beneath the mountain snow for the reunion that only death could provide. The cemetery lay behind the small white church at the edge of town, its simple wooden crosses and weathered headstones standing like sentinels against the mountain backdrop. Snow covered everything in a blanket of pristine white, broken only by the dark paths that Shadow had worn with his daily visits. The dog led them through the gates with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Sarah's grave was easy to find. Shadow went directly to it, sitting beside a plain granite headstone that bore her name and dates in simple, unadorned letters. But what made Amos's breath catch was the smaller cross beside it, carved from what looked like aspen wood and bearing a single name, Emma Rose. "They're together," he whispered, the words forming clouds in the frigid air. "Sarah asked to be buried next to her," Eleanor said quietly. "Said she'd spent too many years separated from her children. She didn't want to spend eternity that way too." Amos knelt in the snow between the two graves, his weathered hands coming to rest on the cold earth that covered his family. The headstones were simple, almost austere, but someone had been caring for this plot with obvious devotion. The snow had been cleared from the inscriptions, and fresh evergreen boughs lay across both graves like green blankets. "Who's been tending them?" "Shadow, mostly. He brings things, sticks, pretty stones, sometimes flowers in summer. But the whole town helps. Sarah touched so many lives here that keeping her grave neat feels like the least we can do." Shadow settled beside Amos, his warm presence a comfort in the bitter cold. The dog's eyes held a depth of understanding that seemed almost human, as if he recognized the significance of this moment. The first time in 30 years that husband, wife and daughter had been in the same place. Even if death had made the reunion possible, Amos pulled off his gloves and reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing the locket Eleanor had given him. The metal was warm from his body heat, and when he opened it, the tiny photographs of Thomas and Emma seemed to glow in the pale winter sunlight. "I brought Thomas," he said to Sarah's headstone, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought you'd want to see him again, want them to be together somehow." He pressed the locket to his lips, then placed it gently on Sarah's grave, where it nestled in the evergreen boughs, like a small, precious ornament. The gesture felt right, felt like the completion of something that had been broken for far too long. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words he'd carried for 30 years finally finding their voice. "Sorry I wasn't strong enough to help you heal after Thomas died. Sorry I didn't understand that your leaving wasn't about not loving me. It was about loving me too much to let me watch you break apart." The wind stirred the evergreen branches, creating a sound like whispered voices. Shadow whined softly and pressed closer to Amos, offering the comfort that words couldn't provide. "I'm sorry I never knew about Emma," Amos continued, his hand resting on the smaller grave. "Sorry I wasn't there when she was born, when she took her first steps, when she—" His voice broke completely and he bent forward, overwhelmed by the magnitude of all he'd missed, all that could never be recovered. Eleanor's hand settled on his shoulder, warm and steady. "She knew about you," she said softly. "Sarah told her stories about her papa who lived far away, but loved her very much. Emma used to pretend you were coming to visit, would set an extra place at their little table and tell Sarah to save some cookies for Papa. The image of his daughter, their daughter, waiting for a father who would never come nearly undid him completely." Amos pressed his forehead to the cold earth and let the tears come. 30 years of held grief, finally finding release in this quiet place among the dead. When the worst of the storm had passed, he sat back on his heels and looked at the two graves with clearer eyes. These weren't monuments to failure or abandonment. They were testaments to love that had transcended distance and death. Sarah had carried his love with her to this mountain town, had passed it on to their daughter, and to all the children who'd called her mother. "I want to make something," he said suddenly. "For Emma, something permanent." Eleanor nodded as if she'd been expecting this. "Tom Henley's workshop is still open. His son, Jake, has the same skills with wood as his father did. I'm sure he'd be honored to help." Amos stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold and the emotional strain. But his purpose was clear now, crystallized by the sight of his daughter's simple wooden cross. Emma deserved better than a temporary marker. She deserved something that would last, something that spoke of a father's love finally finding its expression. "I'll carve it myself," he said, his voice steady for the first time in days. "I may not have been able to give her anything in life, but I can give her this." A proper headstone made by her father's hands. Shadow stood as well, tail wagging slightly as if approving of the decision. The dog had been guardian of these graves for 3 years, keeping watch over Sarah and Emma with the devotion that only pure love could inspire. But perhaps it was time for that vigil to be shared, for the living to take up the burden of remembrance alongside the faithful companion who'd never forgotten. Jake Henley proved to be as generous with his time as his father had been with his woodcarving skills. The workshop behind the general store smelled of sawdust and pine pitch, familiar scents that reminded Amos of his own father's hands, teaching him to shape wood into useful things. Jake, a man of perhaps 40 with gentle eyes and work-hardened hands, listened to Amos's request with the same quiet dignity that seemed to characterize everyone in Silver Point. "Granite would last longer," Jake offered, running his fingers along a piece of seasoned oak. "But if you want to carve it yourself, wood has more soul. Miss Sarah always said that things made by loving hands carry part of the maker's heart." Amos selected a piece of maple that had been seasoned for years, its grain flowing like water frozen in time. The wood felt warm under his touch, alive despite being long separated from its roots. This would become Emma's monument, shaped by the father who'd never held her but who would love her for eternity. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening, his hands remembering skills he'd learned as a boy, helping his father build furniture for their Kansas farmhouse. The headstone took shape slowly, not ornate but solid and beautiful in its simplicity. Across the top, he carved a border of roses, remembering that Emma's middle name had been Rose and that Sarah had always loved flowers. Shadow lay nearby, watching the work with patient eyes. Occasionally the dog would rise and sniff at the wood shavings as if checking the progress by scent. When Amos paused to rest his aching hands, Shadow would press against his leg, offering wordless encouragement. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Amos said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "This is me finally being a father to her, the only way I can." The inscription took the longest. Amos carved each letter with painstaking care, stopping frequently to ensure the words were straight and deep enough to last through decades of mountain weather. When he finished, the headstone read, "Emma Rose McBride, beloved daughter, November 3rd, 1895, October 15th, 1898, safe in father's arms at last below the dates." He added a small carving of 2 hands clasped together, one large, one small, representing the bond between father and daughter that death had prevented but love had finally made real. As he worked, Eleanor and Martha came by with coffee and sandwiches, understanding that this was more than craftsmanship, it was ritual, healing, the sacred act of a father claiming his child. They spoke little, but their presence filled the workshop with the warmth of community that had sustained Sarah through her years of exile. When the headstone was finished, Amos stepped back to examine his work. The maple glowed golden in the lamplight, its surface smooth except where his tools had carved the letters and decorations. It wasn't the most elaborate marker in the cemetery, but it was made with love, and that made it precious beyond measure. "She would have been proud," Martha said softly, running her fingers along the carved roses. Sarah always said that the most beautiful things came from hands that worked with love instead of obligation. They installed the headstone the next morning, the whole town turning out to witness the ceremony. Pete Garrison said a few words about love that transcends death, about fathers and daughters united by bonds stronger than time. The children who had been Sarah's last students sang a hymn their teacher had loved, their young voices carrying across the snow-covered cemetery like a blessing. When the headstone was in place, Amos knelt once more between the graves of his wife and daughter. But this time, instead of overwhelming grief, he felt something approaching peace. The terrible questions that had haunted him for 30 years finally had answers. The love he'd carried all these years finally had a destination. "I need to tell you both something," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I forgive you, Sarah, for leaving, for keeping Emma a secret, for thinking that protecting me from loss was more important than sharing love. I understand now that you did what you thought was best, that your choices came from love, not abandonment." He placed his hand on Emma's new headstone, feeling the smooth wood that his own tools had shaped. "And Emma, sweetheart, I need you to forgive me too, for not being there, for not knowing you existed, for missing every day of your short life. I'll never stop regretting those lost years, but I promise you this, I'll carry your memory with the same love your mama did. And I'll honor both of you with whatever years I have left." Shadow settled beside him. The dog's warm presence a reminder that love takes many forms, that loyalty and devotion can bridge even the gap between species. Together, they sat in the growing dusk, watching snow begin to fall like blessings on the graves of the women who had shaped both their lives. For the first time in 30 years, Amos McBride felt complete, not because his family had been restored, death had made that impossible, but because he finally understood the full scope of the love they'd shared, the sacrifices they'd made, and the way their story had continued even in separation. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the cemetery trees, but it no longer sounded mournful to Amos's ears. Instead, it sounded like whispered conversations, like laughter carried on the air, like the voices of loved ones welcoming him home. Spring came late to Silver Point that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the town from a black-and-white photograph into something alive with color and possibility. The snow that had blanketed Emma's new headstone melted away to reveal the careful carving beneath, and the cemetery filled with wildflowers that seemed to spring from the very graves they adorned. Amos had stayed through the winter, finding purpose in ways he'd never expected. The abandoned cabin had become truly his home, filled with Sarah's belongings and warmed by memories that no longer brought only pain. Shadow had become his constant companion, the two of them sharing an understanding born of mutual loss and the comfort of living presence. But it was the children who had truly saved him. Word had spread through the valley that the old schoolhouse might reopen, that the husband of their beloved teacher Sarah had offered to take up her work. They came in ones and twos at first, children whose parents worked the few remaining mines, farm families who lived in isolated cabins and hungered for education. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor had told him when he'd first proposed the idea. "Teaching school is different from carving headstones. It requires daily patience, endless hope, the ability to see potential in young minds that might not show it right away." "Sarah did it," Amos had replied simply. "If I'm going to honor her memory, I should honor all of it, not just the parts that feel comfortable." The first day of the new school term dawned clear and bright, with the kind of mountain air that made everything seem possible. 8 children had enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14, their faces bright with curiosity and the nervousness that comes with new beginnings. Amos stood at the front of the classroom where Sarah had once stood, feeling her presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. "My name is Mr. McBride," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I'm here because someone very special to me once taught in this room. Someone who believed that every child deserves the chance to learn and grow and become whoever they're meant to be." He'd prepared a formal lesson about letters and numbers, but something made him change course. Instead, he found himself telling them about Sarah, not the sad parts, but the joyful ones, about how she'd turned learning into games, how she'd made each child feel special and capable, how she'd believed that education was the greatest gift one person could give another. "Mrs. Sarah used to teach here," said Mary Kellerton, Martha's granddaughter, a serious girl of 10 with her grandmother's intelligent eyes. "Mama says she was the best teacher who ever lived." "Your mama was right," Amos said. and I'm going to try my best to teach the way she did, with patience and kindness and the belief that every one of you has something important to offer the world. The days fell into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Mornings in the classroom, working with children who reminded him daily of the teacher who'd shaped this community. Afternoons reading or walking with Shadow, processing the grief that had transformed from a weight into something he could carry alongside joy. Evenings by the fire, often with Eleanor or Martha or Pete for company, sharing stories of Sarah and the life she'd built in this mountain town. He wrote letters now, real ones that got mailed, to his brother in Kansas, explaining his decision to stay in Colorado permanently. To former neighbors, sharing news of Sarah's fate and his own unexpected happiness. To Sarah's sister Emma in Missouri, finally telling her the full story of what had happened to the woman whose letters she'd faithfully forwarded for 30 years. Dear Emma, he wrote in one such letter, I know this news will come as a shock, but I wanted you to know that I've found Sarah at last. Not alive as we'd hoped, but at peace in a place where she was deeply loved. She never forgot you, never stopped being grateful for your loyalty and discretion. She understood why you couldn't tell me where she was, and I want you to know that I understand too. I'm staying in Silver Point, continuing the work Sarah started here. It feels like the right way to honor her memory, not by mourning what we lost, but by nurturing what she built. If you ever want to visit, to see where your sister found peace, you would be welcome here. The whole town would want to meet the woman who helped Sarah stay connected to home, even when she couldn't come back to it. But perhaps the most important letter was the one he never sent, a letter to Sarah herself, written on their wedding anniversary and placed on her grave beside the fresh flowers that appeared there regularly. Gifts from students past and present who remembered their teacher with enduring love. My dearest Sarah, it read, Today marks 35 years since we promised to love each other through whatever trials life might bring. I know now that we kept that promise, even when distance and death tried to break it. Your love shaped everything you did in this place, and now it shapes everything I do. I'm teaching your children or their children in the classroom where you found your calling. I'm learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, but finding ways to honor it while building something new. You taught me that. You and Emma and all the children who've called you mother. Shadow is well and happy. He still visits your grave every day, but now he brings me with him, and I think that makes the vigil easier for both of us. We're taking care of each other, the way families do. I love you still, will always love you. But the love has changed shape, become something that can exist alongside joy instead of being poisoned by regret. Thank you for teaching me that too. Forever yours, Amos. As summer deepened and the wildflowers reached their full glory, Eleanor stopped by the cabin one evening with a camera she'd ordered from Denver. She found Amos sitting on his porch with Shadow at his feet, both of them watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Hold still, she said, raising the camera. Sarah always said that some moments were too precious not to preserve. The photograph she took that evening would become one of Amos's most treasured possessions, an image of a man and dog at peace, surrounded by the beauty of a place that had given them both a second chance at family. When it was developed, Eleanor had copies made for the whole town, each one inscribed with the same words, New Beginnings in Silver Point. Summer 1925, but Amos knew the real inscription should have been different. It should have read, Love never truly ends. It just finds new ways to express itself, new lives to touch, new hopes to nurture. That was Sarah's legacy, and now it was his as well. In the mountains of Colorado, where the snow guarded secrets and love transcended death, a family had finally found its way home.